How can a good God allow evil to exist? I mean, it's one of the oldest, toughest questions in all of theology. Well, in this explainer, we're going to dive into a really powerful analogy that tries to give an answer, the idea of evil as a jeweler's cloth. So here's our game plan for unpacking this. We're going to start with the analogy itself, what it is. Then we'll look at why this dark cloth, might actually be necessary. From there, we'll hit the biggest problem. Does this make God the author of evil? Then we'll explore suffering as a kind of education, before we wrap up by comparing two different views to see how this whole analogy really stacks up.
All right, so the whole idea we're digging into here is this classic metaphor. It's really designed to help us get our heads around a world that, let's be honest, holds both incredible beauty and, at the very same time, some truly terrible darkness.
And this right here, this is the heart of the whole thing. The idea is that God's glory and His grace are like this brilliant, shining jewel. But, to really see that brilliance, to appreciate it, you need something to set it against. So in this view, evil is like that dark jeweler's cloth. It has no real value on its own, but its entire purpose is to make that jewel just pop.
Now, it is absolutely crucial to understand the theological framework that this whole analogy lives in. It's called providentialism. This is the belief that God is totally sovereign over everything that happens. Literally nothing is outside of His will. And as you can probably guess, that sets the stage for some very, very tough questions.
Okay, so that immediately begs a question, right? If God is all-powerful, why would He even need this dark cloth? I mean, why not just have the jewel shine all by itself? Well, the argument is that contrast isn't just helpful, it's essential for us to even perceive things.
And the logic here is grounded in a really simple physical principle. Think about it. If you're in a room that's just flooded with pure white light, you can't really see the light itself. It's just everywhere. You need shadows, you need a dark background to even perceive how bright it is. This argument takes that physical reality and applies it to a spiritual one.
So the argument kind of breaks down into three steps. First, you've got the proposition. God ordains or decrees the experience of evil, the black cloth, so that we can truly see His goodness. Step 2 is the mystery. This is all framed as an act of love, designed to maximize our joy in the end. But step 3 is the real linchpin here. For this to actually be a loving act, everyone, and I mean everyone, has to eventually see the jewel. If some people are just left with the black cloth forever, the whole analogy just completely falls apart.
And this is where we hit a major fork in the road, with two competing ideas. On one side, you have universalism, which is the belief that every single soul is ultimately saved and reconciled to God. On the other, you have infernalism, the belief that some people are condemned to eternal punishment. Now, according to the source for this explainer, that jeweler's cloth analogy, it only stays logical if you're looking at it from a universalist point of view. Otherwise, that cloth isn't a backdrop, it's a permanent shroud for some.
But, and this is a big but, this whole line of thinking slams right into a huge challenge. This is the one that really puts the entire analogy to the test.
So here it is, the question in its starkest form. If God purposefully decreed this black cloth, does that make Him the source, the creator, the actual author of evil itself?
You see, this creates a pretty serious logical trap. If God literally made evil as a thing, like a tool to achieve His purposes, then from His perspective, it must be a good tool. And if it's a good tool, how can it actually be evil? And on top of that, why would anyone get punished for using a tool that God Himself made and provided? It starts to get really messy. You end up with this really strange, fundamental contradiction. If evil is just a good tool for a good purpose, its very nature gets twisted. It's not actual evil anymore. It becomes what the source calls dark good. And at that point, the word evil just loses all its meaning.
So how does the argument get out of this mess? Well, here's the proposed counter-logic. It's a huge distinction. God didn't create the cloth. Instead, He seized it. The darkness, the evil, that comes from humanity's own free choices. And God, in His sovereignty, takes that very darkness and uses it as the backdrop for His light. He basically repurposes our mess for His glory.
Okay, so that leads us to the next big question. What's the whole point of experiencing this black cloth? Is it meant to be a lesson, something educational, or is it just purely destructive?
The source uses this really, really intense analogy to make the distinction crystal clear. Think about it. A good education might be letting a child touch a warm plate so they learn what hot means. But forcing a child into a furnace just so they can experience heat, well, that's not education. That's just destruction. So the question is, which one is this?
And this is where we find the second escape hatch for this argument, and once again, it's tied directly to universalism. The argument is that the furnace, the experience of sin and all its awful consequences, it's not a final destination, it's purgatorial, it's a refining process.
Now, it's really important we're clear on what purgatorial means right here. In this context, it just means a process of cleansing or purification. The suffering that comes from evil isn't for destruction's sake. Instead, it's the very thing that cleanses a person and ultimately turns them back towards the good, back towards that brilliant jewel.
All right, let's put all the pieces on the board. We're going to compare this universalist view directly with a more traditional theological framework, Calvinism, which usually includes a belief in eternal punishment. We'll see how the logic of the jeweler's cloth really holds up when you put them side by side.
Okay, take a look at this table. It lays out the key differences. For the universalist view, the black cloth is temporary. It's just a teaching tool. But in traditional Calvinism, that cloth is an eternal, horrifying reality for some people. And look at the difference in God's supposed intent. Is it to maximize everyone's vision of the jewel, or is it to display justice by punishing some people forever? The source argues that this is where the Calvinist view contradicts itself, claiming a God of love decrees eternal torture. In that view, the word good starts to sound a lot like its opposite, whereas in the universalist model, it stays consistent.
So the argument's conclusion is that by using this universalist framework for the jeweler's cloth, you end up with what's called a logical teleology. That's just a fancy way of saying the end goal, everyone being reconciled and seeing the jewel, makes sense of the difficult beginning and all the pain in the middle. The end explains the means.
So, let's do a super quick recap of the big takeaways from this whole argument. First, the jeweler's cloth frames evil not as a thing in itself, but as a necessary contrast for us to see the good. Second, universalism is presented as the logical key that keeps you from having a moral contradiction. Third, this reframes God's role. He doesn't create evil as a substance, he uses the darkness that's already there as a backdrop. And finally, that means the experience of suffering is ultimately educational and restorative, not just destructive.
And all of that leaves us with this final, really provocative question that's drawn from the source material. When we run into difficult concepts in old texts like Gehenna, should we see them as a final trash heap of permanent destruction? Or should we see them as a refiner's fire, a painful yes, but ultimately purifying process of restoration? Definitely something to think about.